They called it the black gift of poison, so lethal and so precise that not even the most resilient species in the galaxy could survive a single drop over centuries. The Dominion had perfected it, engineered it with surgical care to be the ultimate deterrent. The final argument in any negotiation, it had ended. Rebellions silenced dissent and proven again and again that defying the Dominion was a death sentence. When the humans sat in the war chamber and lifted the cup, everyone present expected the same. Result, a demonstration of dominance, a message delivered in liquid death, the general himself. Korak had used this very poison to eliminate threats without lifting a single weapon. So when the humans sniffed the drink as if it were wine, and then without hesitation took a sip, the room fell into stunned silence. The impossible had happened, and no one knew how to react for a moment. No one moved, no one breathed. Officers hissed and twitched, some backing away in fear, as if the poison would leap from the human and kill them by proximity. Others reached for their weapons, thinking it had to be a trick. But the human calmly set the cup down, smacked his lips, and casually said, "Not bad," as if he had just sampled a new brew. Korak could not believe what he was seeing. He had witnessed warriors collapse from mere exposure to the black gift, had seen entire planets brought under control with just the mention of its name. And yet this human with no armor, no visible defenses, sat completely unbothered staring at. The assembled Dominion leadership, with a calmness that bordered on insulting Korak, ordered a stronger dose, triple the concentration, enough to kill a warlord in seconds. The aide hesitated, visibly disturbed, but obeyed and poured the thick, syrupy liquid into a fresh cup. The human again picked it up, held it to the light, and without a word drank it all in one motion. The chamber froze, every eye locked on him. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The human leaned back, sighed, and said, "That one's got a bit more." Korak felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Fear, or perhaps confusion, either way. It left him unsettled. The human offered no explanation at first, just a shrug and a guess. Maybe it was the liver, maybe gut bacteria, maybe their species had evolved to withstand poison because their ancestors kept eating suspicious things. The explanation was vague, almost dismissive, and yet terrifying, because it meant the Dominion had no idea what it was dealing with. Korak tried to reassert control, demanding to know if the human had known what the cup contained. The human confirmed he had but drank it anyway out of curiosity, just to see what would happen. That answer shook the very foundation of Dominion doctrine, which was built on the premise that survival instinct was universal. That fear was an effective tool. The human had broken that rule effortlessly, and with a smile, worse still, he asked for something stronger. Korak had considered humans to be primitive, weak, adaptable. Perhaps, but not. Formidable, certainly not immune. And now he was confronted with the possibility that his entire understanding of the species was wrong. The black gift was supposed to be their failsafe, the weapon that brought all other species to heel, and this human had treated it like a novelty drink. The implications were enormous. If this human was not unique, if more of them were like this, then everything the Dominion planned, every war calculated, every campaign of fear and intimidation would have to be reconsidered. The human leaned forward and asked if they had ever heard of how humans dealt with poison on Earth. No one answered. He continued explaining how humans adapted, how some even trained themselves by consuming small doses over time. How instead of dying, they learned to survive the poison. The cup he had just emptied was proof of that legacy. Korak tried to hold on to protocol, tried to regain the upper hand, but the moment was slipping away and he knew it. His threats now sounded hollow. His greatest weapon was ineffective, and the human knew it. The conversation turned to the future, and the human made it clear that if the Dominion intended to treat humanity as it had treated other species, it would fail worse. It would provoke a response that the Dominion could not predict and possibly could not survive. Korak mentioned blockades, cutting off trade routes and resources to starve humanity into submission, but the human just smiled and told him about the siege of Earth, when a coalition of powers much stronger than the Dominion had tried the same thing and failed. Humanity had adapted, had found alternatives, and eventually had turned the tide and crushed its enemies. The Dominion had never faced such a foe, not because of raw power, but because of a mindset that refused to yield the human. was not making threats, he was stating facts. Korak could see it. Now humanity would not break. Like others had, they would resist, adapt, and retaliate. The human offered a different path, cooperation rather. Than conquest, he did not demand surrender, nor did he beg for peace. He simply presented it as the smarter option. And to Korak, that was perhaps the most terrifying part. This was not a man desperate to avoid war. This was a man who knew that war would come, and who was certain that his people would outlast whatever the Dominion threw at them. And in the silence that followed, Korak realized he had to choose between continuing on a path that might lead to costly destruction or taking a new approach. With a species that clearly did not fear him, and with that he gave the order to begin discussions for the first time in memory. The Dominion would negotiate not because it wanted to, but because it no longer had a choice. The moment the human lifted the cup and casually took a sip of the Dominion's most refined and lethal poison, known as the Black Gift, everything in the war chamber came to a sudden halt. The generals, the officers, the advisors, even the guards all froze as if the very laws of reality had been broken. For centuries. The Black Gift had been a symbol of dominance, a silent and absolute killer, one that had claimed the lives of warlords, traitors, and rebels without fail. No species had ever survived it, no matter how resilient, no matter how advanced. So when the human not only survived but responded with a calm, "Not bad," and placed the cup back on the table like he had just sampled a mediocre drink, the psychological ground beneath the Dominion cracked. Korak, the seasoned general of the Hadron Dominion, stared at the human, his mandibles tense, his thoughts racing. This was not how the scenario was supposed to go. The poison was meant to send a message to display the futility of resistance, and yet the message had backfired spectacularly. The human remained calm, composed, and utterly unimpressed when Korak ordered a second dose, this time with triple the concentration, something that had previously reduced even the most hardened warriors into twitching husks. The human drank it just as casually, swirling the viscous liquid before tossing it back in one gulp. A few more seconds of silence passed, and then came the casual sigh and the remark that this one had a bit more bite. The chamber did not know how to respond. There were no protocols for this, no strategy for when the enemy simply refused to die. The fear that crept into the room was not the fear of a weapon, but of the unknown. For the first time, the Dominion faced an adversary they could not predict. The human was not gloating, not making threats. He was simply treating their ultimate weapon like a curiosity. And that indifference was more terrifying than any open defiance. Korak attempted to probe further, demanding to know if the human understood what he had just ingested. The human confirmed he did. He had understood it was meant to kill him, and still he drank, not because of bravery, but because he was curious, because he wanted to know if it would work on humans. That simple explanation shook Korak more than any dramatic speech. It revealed a mindset alien to Dominion logic, where fear was not the controlling factor, but rather curiosity and calculated risk. The human even offered theories as to why he might have survived. Maybe the liver, maybe gut bacteria, maybe generations of exposure to questionable substances on their homeworld. None of these answers were definitive, but they hinted at something deeper, an evolutionary trajectory built not on dominance, but on adaptability. The Black Gift was designed to bypass armor and genetic resistance to render biological differences irrelevant. It was a universal equalizer, and now it had failed in front of an entire war council. And worse, the human showed no signs of weakness. He asked for stronger drinks. He leaned forward and engaged in conversation as if the situation were no more serious than a trade dispute. Korak had studied humans. He had seen reports and files gathered from reconnaissance missions and prisoner interrogations. He had dismissed most of it as exaggerated tales of resilience and stubbornness. But now, faced with this undeniable proof, he had to reconsider everything. The human spoke again, casually explaining how humanity had learned to survive poisons, how some of their ancestors had deliberately ingested toxins in small amounts to build resistance, how their species had evolved not to avoid death, but to challenge it, adapt to it, and ultimately overcome it. The empty cup on the table was no longer just a failed weapon test. It was a symbol, either turning point, a warning. Korak realized that the Dominion had encountered a species that did not fit the mold. Their strategies had been built upon. Dominion doctrine was based on fear, control, superiority. The Black Gift was the embodiment of that philosophy, but the human had reduced it to a beverage, and in doing so shattered the psychological foundation of their power structure. Korak considered his next move carefully. He knew that the rest of the Dominion leadership would be watching how he handled this. If he responded with more threats, he risked revealing desperation. If he ordered an attack, he might trigger a conflict the Dominion was not prepared for. Not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked understanding of what they were up against. He chose instead to continue the conversation, trying to steer it back into familiar territory by invoking larger strategies like economic pressure, blockades, and isolation. But the human was ready for that too. Referencing the Siege of Earth, a historical event in which a much larger coalition had tried the same tactics and failed, humanity had adapted, survived, and eventually retaliated until those empires were no more. The message was clear: humanity would not be broken by conventional means. They were not invincible, but they were relentless, and most dangerously of all, they were used to being underestimated. When Korak tried to frame Dominion dominance as inevitable, the human countered with historical precedent, with reason, with a calm assurance that implied experience and preparation. And when he offered cooperation instead of confrontation, it was not a plea. It was a calculated proposition. Korak understood the weight of the moment. This human sitting casually in the Dominion's war chamber had done more damage with words and gestures than any fleet ever had. And it was not just what he said, it was the way he said it. The unshakable calm, the steady gaze, the lack of fear or need to posture. It forced Korak to confront a possibility he had never entertained, that humanity might not be just another obstacle to conquer, but a force that could withstand anything thrown at them and keep coming back stronger. And so, with the taste of failure still bitter on his tongue and the eyes of the chamber still locked on the human, Korak realized that everything had changed. The Dominion would need a new strategy, because the one they had just shattered, like the illusion of invincibility, it was built upon. Korak had never known fear. Not really, not in the way most species understood it. He had stood on the bridges of warships as orbital bombardments reduced cities to ash. He had watched entire civilizations fall beneath the boot of the Dominion. Without blinking, he had sentenced rebels to death and never once questioned the righteousness of his command to him. Power was certainty, and certainty meant control. But as he watched the human calmly place the empty cup of Black Gift poison back on the table and smile as if he had merely finished a drink at a diplomatic reception, Korak felt something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. It was not the poison that had failed. It was the illusion of invincibility that had cracked. This human had not flinched, had not begged or panicked. He had not even hesitated. He drank the first dose, then the second, more concentrated than the first, and showed nothing more than mild amusement and a casual remark about its strength. It was not bravado, not some desperate bluff. It was quiet, confident, indifference, and that more than anything else shook Korak to his core. The Dominion had conquered hundreds of systems, had mapped every species, measured their physiology, cataloged their limits, and engineered their tools of war. Accordingly, the Black Gift had been the result of that precision science, the final solution to resistance, the thing that reminded all who opposed them that death was inevitable and could arrive in a sip. And now it had failed, and the man who had proven that failure was not just alive but unimpressed. The other officers in the chamber shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence crumbling beneath the weight of uncertainty. Some still believed this must be a trick, some mutation or anomaly. But Korak saw it for what it was, a warning, not a threat, not a weapon, but something worse, a variable they had not accounted for. The human leaned back, his expression still casual as he offered explanations, half serious, half hypothetical about why he might have survived. Maybe gut bacteria, maybe the liver, maybe the long evolutionary dance humanity had done with poisons and venoms on their death world. And it was the way he said it, Not like someone boasting, but someone who simply saw no reason to fear. Korak pressed harder, demanded to know what kind of arrogance led someone to knowingly drink a substance that killed entire species. And the human replied with a shrug and said curiosity, like a child poking at something dangerous. Not because he was reckless, but because he wanted to. Understand that single word struck Korak harder than any weapon had, because it spoke to something fundamental that separated their species. Dominion's strategy was based on predictability, dominance, intimidation, control. But humans seem built for unpredictability, for adaptation, for surviving the impossible and asking for more. Korak had always believed fear was universal, and now he was forced to question that belief. He ordered the room sealed, not to trap the human, but to contain the situation. He needed time to think, to reassert control. But the human did not react as expected. He did not protest, did not draw a weapon or demand release. Instead, he stayed seated, continued talking, and slowly dismantled everything the Dominion had assumed about human nature. The conversation turned to tactics, to blockade strategies and resource denial, and again the human remained unshaken. He spoke of a time when Earth had been besieged, when multiple empires had tried to starve them into surrender and failed. He explained how they had adapted, innovated, and eventually turned the tide, and how those empires were now extinct. The implication was clear: history favored humanity, not because they were the strongest, but because they never stopped changing, never stopped resisting. Korak found himself listening, not as a conqueror, but as a man trying to understand something deeply alien. He tried to assert that the Dominion did not rely solely on force, but on inevitability, that the cost of resistance would be too high, and the human countered that the cost of underestimating humanity would be higher still. And the worst part was Korak believed him, not because he wanted to, but because the facts were undeniable. Their best weapon had failed, their psychological warfare had been ignored, and now they were being offered a way out. Not as a surrender, but as a shift in thinking. The human was not demanding peace. He was offering logic. Korak did not like being backed into a corner. His entire career had been about ensuring no one could do that to him, and yet here he was, a single human had walked into his war chamber, survived the unsurvivable, and casually rewritten the rules of engagement. Korak knew he could order. The human executed could try to reclaim control through violence, but something told him that would be the biggest mistake of his life, because this was not just about one human. It was about what that human represented: an entire species that did not play by the rules the Dominion had built its empire on. Korak had thought humans were an inconvenience, at best resilient, but ultimately defeatable. Now he saw the truth: they were a different kind of threat. Not because they could fight, but because they refused to lose, because they turned obstacles into challenges and turned challenges into evolution. And suddenly he realized that he was not staring at the edge of another campaign. He was staring at the beginning of a shift, a moment in time when the Dominion would either adapt or begin its decline. And so as the human stood and made one final comment about the drink needing a citrus kick, Korak remained seated, not because he was defeated, but because he was finally thinking not about conquest, but about survival. And that more than anything terrified him. The human sat calmly in his chair, arms resting casually on the table, while a storm of disbelief brewed in the war chamber. Around him, he had justified everything the Dominion believed about power and mortality by drinking 2 cups of the black gift, their most lethal poison, and surviving without so much as a cough, and instead of collapsing in agony, like every other species exposed to even a droplet. He leaned forward, smiled, and asked if they had anything stronger. Korak, the Dominion general, who had overseen the destruction of entire civilizations, found himself staring at this soft-skinned creature with a mixture of awe, confusion, and something dangerously close to respect. The black gift was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the Dominion's dominance, a biological scalpel that could cut through even the most defiant species. It had no antidote because no antidote was ever needed. It had never failed until today. Korak had built his strategies on fear, on the idea that if you could make your enemies believe resistance was death, then half the battle was already won. But this human had not flinched, he had not begged or pleaded for mercy. He had understood exactly what he was drinking, and he did it anyway out of curiosity. Word Korak was still trying to process in this context, not defiance, not desperation, just curiosity. The human claimed he wanted to see if it worked on his kind, and when it did not, he shrugged as if that outcome was merely one of several possible scenarios. Korak could not decide if it was courage or insanity, but he was beginning to realize that maybe it was something else entirely, something more dangerous: resilience, without arrogance, confidence, without cruelty, a kind of strength that came not from superior weapons but from an unshakable belief in survival. The Dominion had always assumed that once their enemies saw the full extent of their power, they would fold, give in, and beg for terms. But this human was offering terms of his own, not as a surrender, not as a plea, but as a calculated suggestion that the Dominion rethink its strategy, that perhaps cooperation might cost less than conflict. And as much as Korak hated the idea, he could not deny the logic the human had proven that one of one. The Dominion's most relied upon weapons was ineffective against at least some humans, and if some were immune, that meant others might be too, and if they could not be reliably killed, then they could not be reliably controlled. The human spoke with the ease of someone who had seen worse and lived through it, who had not just survived poison, but had come from a world that tried to kill its inhabitants in 1,000 ways every day. And instead of dying, they adapted, they endured. They found strength in suffering and knowledge in pain. And it dawned on Korak that the Dominion had never truly faced a species like this before. Yes, they had fought clever enemies. Yes, they had encountered stubborn resistance. But this was something else. This was a species that turned its trauma into evolution and its history into armor. And the more the humans spoke, the more Korak understood that this was not an outlier, not a fluke, but a reflection of a broader truth about humanity. The story of the siege of Earth, confirmed at a time when powerful alien empires had tried to isolate and crush the planet by cutting off its supply lines and resources, hoping to force surrender, only for humanity to adapt and eventually retaliate, wiping those empires from existence. This was not bravado, it was a warning rooted in history. The human did not speak of war with excitement or threat. He spoke of it with the tired certainty of someone who knew what would come if the Dominion pushed too hard, and it was that certainty that made the offer of peace sound so sincere. Korak tried to argue that the Dominion relied not just on force, but on inevitability, that they could bleed humanity dry economically and strategically without ever firing a shot. But the human countered that making survival costly was a game humans had played and won before. And every time someone tried to make them surrender by attrition, it only hardened their resolve and made them more dangerous. The human offered alternatives, trade cooperation, research mutual benefit, anything that would allow both sides to coexist without tearing each other apart. And as much as Korak wanted to dismiss it all as weakness, he could not shake the feeling that rejecting the offer would be a mistake, one that would haunt the Dominion for generations. This man had survived what should have been certain death and responded with a negotiation pitch rather than vengeance. That kind of mindset did not belong to a victim or a conqueror. It belonged to a survivor too, a strategist, to someone who was not trying to win a single battle but the entire game. And Korak had to admit, even if only to himself, that the game had changed, and if the Dominion did not change with it, they might not survive long enough to understand why. He looked around the chamber, saw the unease in his officers, the way none of them knew what to say or how to act. The Black Gift had failed, and with it, the illusion of invincibility they had cloaked themselves in for centuries. Now the only question that remained was whether they would cling to the old ways or accept that a new reality had arrived, shaped not by fear, but by the quiet resilience of a species that refused to die when told they were supposed to. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to listen to the man who had drunk death and called it a mild inconvenience. The human's words lingered in the chamber long after he spoke them, not because they were shouted or laced with threats, but because they carried something far more unsettling: quiet certainty. Korak had spent decades mastering the art of control. Whether it was in battle during tense negotiations or through the calculated use of fear, every action, every word was meant to establish and reinforce the dominance of the Dominion. Yet now, as he faced this lone representative of humanity who had defied death not once but twice, Korak felt control slipping from his grip. The black gift had always worked, always brought its victims to their knees in agonizing moments. Before death, it had been their most precise and absolute method of enforcing loyalty. But this human had drunk it like a casual drink and then asked for more. And when confronted by guards and weapons and threats of blockades, he did not waver. Instead, he leaned forward, rested his elbows on the table, and began to explain, not out of arrogance, but because he genuinely believed that understanding was more effective than intimidation. The chamber remained tense, but the human was at ease. He recounted Earth's history, not just its victories, but the brutal challenges it had faced. He told them of poisonous plants, venomous creatures, natural disasters, diseases, and famine, and explained that instead of being wiped out by those threats, humans had adapted, they learned, and in some cases they even exposed themselves to danger on purpose, not to die but to build resilience, to survive, to evolve. And in doing so, they developed something far more powerful than immunity. They developed mindset, the ability to face certain destruction and continue forward. That mindset was what stood before Korak now in the form of a man who had faced their most feared weapon and survived. The human wasn't asking for surrender, wasn't bargaining for his life. He was calmly dismantling the illusion of dominion, superiority piece by piece, with stories, facts, and questions they could not answer. "What do?" he asked, "when the enemy you thought was weak simply refuses to die? What happens to your strategy when your most terrifying weapon becomes ineffective not through technology or countermeasures, but through biological defiance?" Korak had no answer because there had never been a need for one. Until now, the Dominion had been built on certainty. Every species, every conquest followed a predictable path. Fear led to submission, submission led to control. But now fear had failed, and without it, control was slipping through his claws. The human could see it, not because he was a psychic or spy, but because it was written on every face in the room. The fear was no longer on the side of the humans. It had crossed the table and embedded itself in the Dominion's own ranks. When the human mentioned the siege of Earth, Korak recognized the term from old reports, ones filled with conflicting information and inconsistencies. But the way the human described it, not as legend, but as lived reality, made it clear that the essence of the story was true. Earth had been cut off, blockaded, surrounded by enemies, and instead of collapsing it, adapted it, rationed it, innovated, and when the time came, it struck back and not only survived but erased its enemies from history. That wasn't just a defense strategy, it was a declaration of how humans responded to existential threats, and it terrified Korak, because now he understood that any attempt to wear down humanity would only make them more dangerous. Their strength was not in their numbers or weapons or ships. It was in their refusal to accept defeat, their refusal to break the human. Leaned back, his tone still calm as he laid out his offer. Cooperation over conquest, diplomacy over destruction. Not because they were afraid, but because they understood the cost of war better than most. They were not pleading for peace. They were offering it from a position of confidence the Dominion could continue down the path it always had, force threats, domination. But now, with the knowledge that those tactics might no longer be effective against this particular species, Korak realized he stood at a crossroads. One path led to a war that would be far more difficult than anything they had faced before a war, with an enemy that did not fear death and had proven itself capable of surviving the impossible. The other path was less certain, less glorious perhaps, but possibly more sustainable. It required him to change, to adapt, something the Dominion rarely did, but something humans did instinctively. Korak's pride battled his reason. He had silenced rebellions, crushed resistance, and made examples of entire systems. But this was different. This wasn't defiance for the sake of rebellion. This was defiance rooted in nature, in biology, in history, and it came without hatred or malice. It simply was an immutable fact of who these creatures were. The longer he stared at the human, the more he understood that no amount of force would extract fear from him. Because fear was not part of the equation, he had not walked into the chamber expecting to survive. He had simply accepted the possibility of death and moved forward anyway. That kind of mindset was something Korak could neither defeat nor fully comprehend. And for the first time, he understood what the human meant when he said, "If you kill me, someone else will just come knocking." That was not a threat. That was a statement of fact, a reminder that for every human who fell, another would rise not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, because that was how they survived. And suddenly the idea of cooperation no longer seemed like weakness, but the only rational path forward, one built not on fear, but on mutual recognition that neither side could afford to misunderstand the other. Again, for the Korak had spent his life believing in the inevitability of dominion power. It was a belief forged not from ideology, but from centuries of results. Every rebellion crushed every planet, subdued every voice of dissent, silenced through the precision of overwhelming force and flawless execution. And yet now, as he watched the human stretch in his chair, smile without fear and speak with quiet confidence, Korak felt the first real cracks form in that belief. This was not a miscalculation. It was something more profound, a failure of the very framework the Dominion had trusted for so long. The black gift, their silent dagger. Their final solution had been rendered useless, not through espionage or counterattack, but through simple indifference. The human had drunk it twice, and then offered feedback like it was an exotic beverage at a diplomatic tasting. That act alone was enough to unsettle the room, but what followed truly shifted the balance of the conversation. The human didn't threaten or brag. Instead, he explained. He talked about Earth, about humanity, and about the long, painful process of learning to survive against a world that never cared if they lived or died. He spoke of poisonous plants, venomous predators, contaminated water, and harsh climates, and how over generations, humans had adapted not just physically, but mentally, turning the struggle itself into a survival mechanism. They hadn't just learned to endure suffering. They had learned to expect it, prepare for it, and in some twisted way, even appreciate it as part of what shaped them. Korak sat in silence, trying to process the implications. He had always viewed species through a lens of predictability. Apply pressure enough times in the right places, and even the most defiant would break. But the human was not just unbroken, he was untouched, and his calm demeanor was not an act. It was a reflection of a species that did not measure its strength in weapons or numbers, but in the ability to take damage and keep moving. The Dominion had designed the Black Gift as the ultimate failsafe, a poison so efficient and adaptable that it made resistance seem foolish. But now it was nothing more than colored water to this human, and perhaps to many others. Korak asked carefully, "How many of your kind are like you?" And the human had shrugged and said enough. It was not the quantity that made that answer dangerous, but the ambiguity. It implied unpredictability and uncertainty, the very things the Dominion could not afford in their strategies. The human leaned forward and talked about what fear meant to his people. Not something to be avoided, but something to be studied, conquered, and eventually used as fuel. He explained that threats rarely worked on humans because they had faced extinction in 1,000 forms and learned not to cower but to adapt. He spoke of failed invasions, alien coalitions that had tried to break Earth, and how each time humanity had not only survived but emerged stronger, more united, more relentless. And all of this he shared without arrogance, just with the clarity of someone who understood his people at a fundamental level. And Korak hated how rational it sounded, because everything he had been taught told him to crush defiance swiftly and absolutely. But now he was staring at a species that did not operate under those rules, and whose defiance was not a reaction, but a default setting. Korak had led countless campaigns. He had faced enemy commanders who begged for mercy, who threatened retaliation, who offered bribes or bargains, but never before had he faced someone who sat across from him, unarmed, unmoved, and unfazed, after surviving what should have been certain death, and then proceeded to calmly offer peace. "The Dominion does not retreat," Korak said more to himself than to anyone else. And the human replied without hesitation, "Didn't ask you to." It was that tone that disturbed Korak. The most, it was not confrontational or mocking. It was simply honest. And in that honesty was power, more power than any fleet or weapon could project. Korak tried to assert dominance again, suggesting that if the human had deceived him or shown weakness, the Dominion would respond without mercy, and the human did not flinch. He simply replied that humans made the same promise. And Korak believed him not because he wanted to, but because he could see it in the human's eyes, that conviction, that dangerous certainty that they would endure, not because they had to, but because it was all they knew how to do. And in that moment, Korak realized the Dominion's greatest mistake was assuming that humans feared death the way others did. That fear could be used as leverage, that survival instinct would make them predictable. But the truth was, humans did not survive by avoiding danger. They survived by facing it head-on, adapting to it, absorbing it, and turning it into a lesson. And now that lesson had reached the heart of the Dominion. A single human had walked into their most sacred and secure chamber, drunk their deadliest poison, and left them questioning everything they thought was certain. And in that uncertainty, Korak saw the future not one shaped by dominance, but by necessity, because fighting a species that grew stronger under pressure was not a war. It was a slow suicide. And perhaps just this once, survival meant learning from the very species they had sought to conquer. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, not because of any change in pressure or atmosphere, but because something fundamental had shifted. A truth that had been ignored or underestimated was now standing in front of them, embodied in a single calm, unarmed human who had just proven that the Dominion's greatest weapon, their ultimate deterrent. The black gift was useless against his kind. Korak had always believed that war was about leverage, about strategy, about applying pressure in the right places until your enemy bent or broke. But this man had not bent, and he had not broken. Instead, he had calmly endured what should have killed him twice, and then turned the conversation toward negotiation. Not with fear, not with desperation, but with quiet certainty. The human spoke of blockades and sieges, not as theory, but as lived experience. When Korak had suggested cutting humanity off from resources, from trade, from contact with the rest of the galaxy, the human had smiled, not in defiance, but in understanding. He recounted the Siege of Earth, a dark time in human history when they had been isolated by a coalition of empires far more powerful than the Dominion, and instead of collapsing, Earth had rationed, innovated, and adapted. They had found new ways to survive, had turned scarcity into motivation, and had eventually turned their attention outward, reclaiming space and crushing those who tried to choke the life out of them. It was not a threat. It was a fact. Korak recognized it in the human's tone, in the stillness of his posture, in the way he did not need to raise his voice to make his point clear. You can try the same trick, the human said, but all you'll do is guarantee that when we come back, we won't stop until we win. And the terrifying part, Korak realized, was that he believed him. This was not bravado or propaganda. This was a species that had earned its scars through trial and fire. And the man in front of him was not some military leader or political figure. He was a representative of a mindset that refused to surrender to fear or to pressure. Korak had always believed in inevitability, the idea that resistance to the Dominion was futile, that the machine of conquest would always grind forward, consuming all in its path. But now he saw a flaw in that machine, a weakness, not in their weapons or their ships, but in their assumptions. They had assumed that humans could be controlled like other species, that a show of power would be enough to bring them in line. But this encounter had exposed the error in that belief, and now every plan, every strategy that depended on submission or fear had to be reevaluated. Korak tried once more to assert that the Dominion did not fail, that it was not in their nature to be outmaneuvered, and the human had tilted his head and simply asked, "Then why are we still talking?" And there was no good answer, because deep down Korak knew that if the black gift had worked, there would be no conversation, only the cleanup of another corpse and the beginning of another campaign. But that had not happened, and now the future looked uncertain. Not just for this negotiation, but for the Dominion itself. The human spoke again, not with threats, but with facts, reminding Korak that humanity had always been underestimated by enemies who assumed that soft skin meant soft will, that lack of natural weapons meant weakness. And every time those enemies had paid the price, Korak had reviewed the battle reports, the intelligence briefings, the inconsistencies and strange victories that made no sense. Until now, humans did not win through strength. They won through persistence, through sheer refusal to die when they were supposed to, and that made them far more dangerous than any empire Korak had ever faced. The human leaned in voice low and steady and said, when the day comes that we do fight, it won't be because we want to. It will be because you gave us no choice. And when that happens, you won't just lose battles. You'll lose belief. Belief that your way of doing things always works. Belief that you can outlast any resistance. And once that belief is gone, your empire will start to unravel, not from outside attacks, but from within, because the dominion is only as strong as the fear it inspires, and fear doesn't work on us. Those words hit harder than any weapon could because Korak knew they were true. Fear was the foundation of their rule. The black gift was the symbol of that foundation, and now it had failed, not metaphorically, but literally, visibly, and undeniably. The human stood preparing to leave, and he turned back one last time with a smile and a suggestion that they add a little citrus next time. And then he was gone, leaving behind a chamber full of officers who no longer looked at their leader with certainty, and a general who now had to face the most dangerous question of all. What if we were wrong? Not just about this human, not just about this moment, but about everything. And as that question echoed through Korak's mind, he realized that the hardest battles were not the ones fought with weapons, but the ones fought with truths that shattered the foundations of everything you thought you understood about your enemy, and more importantly, about yourselves. The doors to the war chamber closed behind the human Korak remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the space where the man had stood moments ago. The scent of the black gift still lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of what had just transpired. For the first time in his long, decorated career, Korak felt doubt creeping into his thoughts. He had witnessed rebellions extinguished before they could gain momentum, had overseen the conquest of dozens of systems, had enforced dominion law with absolute certainty, and yet all of that now seemed distant, less relevant in the face of what had just happened. The black gift had always been the dominion's ultimate symbol of control, a silent, untraceable death that needed no armies, no fleets, only a single drop in a single moment to end defiance. But the human had treated it like a beverage, and worse, he had survived and laughed and asked for a stronger version. No one had ever done that. No one was supposed to. The poison had been engineered, refined across centuries to be perfect and unanswerable. And now its failure forced a reckoning. Korak's mind raced through scenarios, through justifications, but none of them held for long. This was not an anomaly. This was not a fluke. The human's behavior had not been that of a fool, nor of a martyr. He had assessed the risk taken, the challenge, and won, and then had the audacity to offer peace. Korak wanted to be angry. He wanted to feel insulted. But what he felt instead was uneasy, because somewhere deep in his thoughts, he recognized that the man had not spoken from arrogance. He had spoken from experience, lived history, and hard truths. When he said humanity would fight back if pushed, it was not a warning. It was a certainty, not because they were powerful, but because they were persistent. And as Korak replayed the conversation in his mind, he realized how many times the human could have escalated and chose not to. How often he could have boasted or threatened and instead offered reason, offered cooperation. The Dominion had always measured strength through control, the ability to silence fear, to crush opposition. But this man had proven that fear itself was not always a weapon. Not when the target had grown up learning to live with it, learning to laugh at it, and learning to overcome it. The chamber had been designed to intimidate the guards, the weapons, the ritual of the poison. It had worked on hundreds of species, and yet it had failed to even rattle one human. And if one could resist, then how many more could? If this man was an outlier, then the Dominion could kill him and pretend this never happened. But if he was not, if he was a reflection of his species, then the Dominion stood on the edge of a very different kind of war. A war not of ships and lasers, but of endurance and resolve. And those were not battles the Dominion had prepared for. Korak thought back to every campaign he had led, every system that had surrendered at the first sign of overwhelming force. He remembered the fear in their eyes, the way they begged for mercy, the way they broke when shown a glimpse of the Dominion's wrath, and now he tried to imagine those same tactics being used on a species that didn't break, that didn't fear, that adapted and came back stronger. And the picture that formed was not one of victory, but of a long, brutal slog. The drained resources, morale, and the illusion of control piece by piece. The human had laid it out not with charts or maps, but with stories, with simple statements that carried the weight of generations behind them. When he spoke of the siege of Earth, Korak had dismissed it as myth, but the way the human described it made it clear it had happened and had changed them. It had shown them how to survive the worst and prepare for the next. It had made them not invincible, but unwilling to lose, and that was far more dangerous. Korak realized that the black gift had not just failed as a poison, it had failed as a symbol, and now its meaning had been rewritten, not as a weapon of the Dominion, but as a challenge humans could overcome. And if they could overcome that, then what else might they overcome in time? Korak had always trusted in the strength of numbers, in the precision of their weapons, in the superiority of their science. But what if those things were not enough? What if adaptability and sheer, stubborn will could undo even the most perfect plans the human had left behind, more than an empty cup he had left behind? A question that Korak would now have to answer, not just to his officers, but to the entire Dominion. What happens when your enemy refuses to die? What happens when they smile in the face of death and then offer to shake hands, not out of fear, but because they know they'll win? In the end, Korak had spent decades preparing for every kind of resistance, but not an enemy who did not view death as the end, but as just another step in the journey. The Dominion could not afford to underestimate humanity again, because next time there might not be a conversation. Next time it might be war. And if that war came, Korak now knew it would not be fought the way they had always fought. It would not be swift or clean. It would be long and costly, and it might change the Dominion forever. And as he sat alone in the chamber, surrounded by silence and failure, he began to understand the true cost of underestimating those who refuse to break, and he knew that the age of easy victories might finally be over. Korak stood in silence long after the human had left the war chamber, his eyes fixed on the sealed doors, as if expecting them to open again and reveal that it had all been some strange hallucination. But the cup remained empty. The poison had been real, and so had the outcome. The black gift had failed, and with it a truth the Dominion had long held sacred was: shattered humans were not what the Dominion had expected, not what they had calculated, not what their centuries of conquest had prepared them for. They had tried to deliver a message of fear, and the response had been a shrug, a casual nod, and a suggestion for better flavoring. The human had walked into their most secure chamber, had faced their most insidious weapon, and had emerged not just alive, but amused and worse. He had offered terms of cooperation, not as a plea, but as a choice, a reasonable proposal grounded in confidence in history, not desperation. The Dominion had never been given such a choice. Before, they had always assumed that power spoke loudest and that those who survived did so by yielding. But now Korak was forced to consider a path he had never thought he would entertain, a path that involved change, discussion, and perhaps even respect. The human had not come to bargain from weakness. He had come as an equal, if not in power, then in presence. And the more Korak reflected, the more he realized that refusing the offer would not bring the Dominion the security it wanted, but the exact opposite. Korak tried to play through the alternatives: war, attrition, blockades, psychological warfare. But with each option, he found a new obstacle, not of military might, but of mindset. How do you defeat a people who do not collapse under pressure, but harden? How do you break a species that builds strength through struggle and identity through survival? The answer was becoming clear. You could not, and even if you tried, the cost would be unimaginable. The human had said that if the Dominion continued down this path, they would lose, maybe not immediately, but eventually. And that was not a threat. It was history speaking. It was the memory of fallen empires that had tried the same route and disappeared from the stars. It was the lived experience of a people who turned scarcity into resolve and fear into focus. Korak had led the Dominion's rise for years, Always certain, always steady, but now the ground beneath him felt unsteady. The Dominion had always expanded by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than its enemies. But what if they had finally met someone smarter, more patient, more willing to bleed, if it meant learning how to win later? What if this human, this single unarmed representative, was not an exception, but a glimpse of what humanity really was? Adaptable, unshaken, and terrifyingly sincere. Korak had believed for so long that war was the only language worth speaking, that peace was a byproduct of domination, and yet now he was being asked to choose a different kind of strength. One that relied not on conquest, but on understanding, on meeting the other side halfway before blood was spilled and planets burned. And it made sense, not in the way that military tactics made sense, but in the way that survival made sense. The Dominion had the power to destroy, but not the certainty to survive the aftermath. And survival was starting to look like the better victory. The human had not flinched when poison touched his lips. He had not begged when the guards reached for their weapons. He had not postured when he had every right to. And that restraint, more than anything, spoke volumes about what kind of enemy they would be and what kind of ally they could become. If the Dominion could look past its own pride, Korak was not naive. He knew accepting the offer would be seen by many as weakness, as deviation from the path carved by those who came before him. But he also knew that the world had changed in a single conversation, and that pretending it had not would only lead to ruin. The future was no longer about who held the biggest weapon, but who could face the unknown without fear and adapt without hesitation. And that was something the human had shown in abundance. It was not about superiority, it was about readiness. The Dominion could crush the systems, but they had never had to deal with a species that invited the crushing as a test that turned defeat into preparation and loss into evolution. As Korak sat back in his chair, claws tapping softly against the polished table, he made his decision not out of surrender, but out of vision. The Dominion would not fall because it compromised. It would endure because it learned. And if humanity was the mirror showing them what they lacked, then perhaps it was time to stop smashing the mirror and start listening. The black gift had failed, but the message it carried was not lost. And maybe that failure was the beginning of something far more powerful than fear. It was the start of a new way forward, one built not on dominance, but on survival and shared understanding. And as Korak prepared to address his council, he felt something unexpected, not defeat, but clarity, because survival was no longer about crushing resistance. It was about becoming worthy of what came next. Korak pressed a command on the side of his chair, unlocking the chamber doors as the guards lowered their weapons and stood at attention. The human turned back briefly, before leaving, offering one final smirk and a remark about the poison's flavor, as if this entire encounter had been nothing more than a tasting session rather than a confrontation between two civilizations standing on the brink of conflict. And yet in some ways that was exactly what it had been, a test not just of poison, but of perception. The Dominion had believed it knew what strength looked like. It believed strength came from control, from eliminating opposition, before it could grow from sending a message so clear that no one dared challenge it. The black gift had always delivered that message in silence and certainty. And now that silence had been broken and certainty had turned into confusion, the human had arrived with no armor, no soldiers, no weapons, just calm words, lived experience, and a tolerance for pain that seemed to mock every assumption the Dominion held about power. And Korak could not stop thinking about the implications of that, because the poison was never meant to fail. And now that it forced every strategy, every doctrine to be re-examined, the Dominion did not lose. And yet today it had been forced to reconsider, not because of force, but because of a conversation, a simple interaction that exposed something far more dangerous than a fleet, a different way of thinking. Korak had seen species rise and fall, had crushed rebellions and silenced dissent without hesitation. But this encounter had left him with something no victory ever had a question. What if everything we built only works because others allowed it to? Because they feared us, because they assumed resistance was futile. But what happens when that fear no longer holds, when the threat becomes the challenge, When your enemies no longer see death as a conclusion, but as a data point, something to learn from and prepare against, the human had not asked for peace. He had offered cooperation not out of weakness, but because it was the logical outcome of two forces, realizing that neither could easily destroy the other, and that in doing so, both might find a path forward without consuming themselves in the process. It was not a surrender, it was strategy. The Dominion could call it diplomacy, but Korak knew better. This was survival. And perhaps the only kind of strength that truly mattered was the kind that recognized when to fight and when to talk, and more importantly, when to listen. Because if this human was any indication, then humanity was a species that did not fit into the neat categories of threat or ally. They were unpredictable, chaotic in the most methodical of ways. And if the Dominion treated them like all the others, they would make the same mistake that empires before them had made. They would provoke a species that did not fear extinction, but turned it into an evolutionary stepping stone. Korak had seen the look in the human's eyes. Not a challenge, not defiance, but inevitability. A quiet confidence that if pushed, humanity would not just fight, they would adapt and become stronger through it. And they would come back not for revenge, but because they refused to leave unfinished business. And as much as it pained him to admit, that terrified him more than any battle ever had, the chamber was empty now. And yet the silence was louder than before, filled with the weight of decisions yet to be made, with the realization that the Dominion's supremacy was no longer unquestioned, and the lesson was clear: fear may win battles, but understanding decides empires. And for the first time in his life, Korak chose to understand, and perhaps in doing so, he had already taken the first step towards saving what he once believed could never be threatened. This story is not just about a human who drank poison and survived it. It is about the danger of assumptions, about the power of mindset, and the cost of arrogance. We often believe that strength comes from invincibility, but true strength lies in resilience, in the ability to adapt, in the willingness to listen to those we once thought beneath us. The black gift was designed to end lives with certainty, but certainty is not truth. And in the end, the human did not just survive the poison. He exposed the fragility of certainty itself. And that is the lesson we carry forward in our world and in our time. We are often too quick to judge others, to rely on fear control, and the belief that what worked yesterday will work again tomorrow. But survival and growth demand more. They demand humility, curiosity, and the courage to see the other side not as an enemy, but as a mirror that shows us what we lack and what we might become if we are brave enough to evolve with them rather than against them.